thanks to the journalism and mass comm department, आदित्य, तौसीफ, नीरज और ऐश्वर्या और भी बहुत लोग जो इस इवेंट को बनाने की जो काम किया है, तो थैंक यू. टुडे इज़ एन इम्पॉर्टेंट डे एंड बच्चों तक पहुंचाना कि अंबेडकर उनका काम और उनकी जो जीवनी है, तो ये बहुत ज़रूरी काम है आज की जो समय है इसमें. तो इसीलिए थैंक यू फॉर डूइंग दिस. एंड व्हेन आदित्य had asked me to give this lecture, मैंने उसको प्रॉमिस किया था कि that I want that this lecture want to be simply a rhetorical one. and so मैं यहाँ ये बोलने नहीं आया हूँ कि डेमोक्रेसी खतरे में है कि उसको बचाने की ज़रूरत है, या संविधान खतरे में है ये उसको बस बचाने की ज़रूरत है, या खुद अम्बेडकर खतरे में है, तो ये नहीं बोलूँगा. बट मैं अपनी लेक्चर शुरू करने से पहले कुछ डेटा है जिसको मैं साझा करना चाहता हूँ. तो टिल लास्ट नाइट व्हेन आई चेक्ड, द टैली ऑफ पीपल हु डाइड फ्रॉम कोविड वाज अराउंड 5.22 lakhs. तो and of course the number of those who were infected is much higher, and it stands at 4.3 crores as of last night. एंड तो ये तो नहीं कह सकते कि डेफिनेटली इंडिया में ही लोग मरे हैं. पैंडमिक है, ग्लोबल पैंडमिक है, दुनिया भर में लोग मरे हैं. तो दिस इज़ नॉट स्पेसिफिक टू इंडिया दैट सो मेनी पीपल हैव डाइड. बट इफ़ यू पुट दिस नंबर टुगेदर विथ द मेडिकल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर दैट इंडिया हैड at the beginning of this pandemic, then the picture seems to get more clear. तो पैंडमिक की शुरुआत में, जो कि पहली लॉकडाउन से पहले, इंडिया में आईसीयू बेड्स, जो कि पब्लिक सेक्टर में आईसीयू बेड्स थे 25,000, 25,778, नहीं सॉरी, हॉस्पिटल्स थे 25,778 इन द पब्लिक सेक्टर. प्राइवेट सेक्टर में तो और भी द नंबर वाज ट्वाइस दिस ऑलमोस्ट. तो प्राइवेट सेक्टर हॉस्पिटल्स थे 43,487. अब इन हॉस्पिटलों के अंदर आईसीयू बेड्स, मैं सिर्फ पब्लिक सेक्टर में अभी कॉन्सेंट्रेट कर रहा हूँ, आईसीयू बेड्स थे 35,699. अब नाउ विद अ पॉपुलेशन ऑफ अराउंड 138 crores, जो कि आई थिंक इज़ फ्रॉम 2020, इंडिया की पॉपुलेशन 138 crores थी. अब 138 crores की पॉपुलेशन के लिए क्या 35,000 आईसीयू बेड्स काफ़ी हैं कोई भी मेडिकल इमरजेंसी या क्राइसिस के साथ डील करने के लिए? तो ये फ़िलहाल ये हमारी कॉन्टेक्स्ट है. ये वो समय है जिसमें हम अंबेडकर को याद कर रहे हैं. अंबेडकर की जयंती मनाने की जो आज इवेंट है, ये हमारी कॉन्टेक्स्ट है. तो इस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हमें इस अंबेडकर जयंती को देखने की ज़रूरत है. और इस कॉन्टेक्स्ट में ना कोई सेलिब्रेशन की माहौल हो सकती है, या ना बस उन अंबेडकर को याद करना कि उनकी पास्ट की जो कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशंस हैं, इस प्रकार की कोई इवेंट करना उचित नहीं होगा. तो इसीलिए टुडे इफ़ वी रिमेंबर अंबेडकर, वी हैव टू रिमेंबर हिम विद ऑल द अनफुलफिल्ड टास्क्स दैट रिमेन, एंड विद द ट्रेचरस रोड दैट रिमेन्स इन फ्रंट ऑफ अस. Like another student who spoke here said that after 70 years, if we have to think that even for a second, if people have all the rights they need, then that is a shame. So this is the context for today's my talk for today. So I hope that my lecture can do some justice to this challenging position that we find ourselves in. So I hope I've categorized my talk in 3 parts. In the first part, I hope to discuss, like what Aditya was mentioning, who Dr. Ambedkar is. Is he a Dalit leader, or is he simply a constitutional figure, or I mean, like who is Dr. Ambedkar? So, and oftentimes when we look back on such a tall political figure in history, so a whole lot of times it so happens that we look at him with a lot of romanticism and nostalgia. So, and today that is also another challenge. Today, how should we remember Dr. Ambedkar? In the second part, I hope to, although briefly, I hope to discuss the nature of Ambedkarite politics. what has come to be today and what its current forms are. And in the conclusion, I hope to problematize this idea that Ambedkar is remembered for being the drafting chairman of the Constituent Assembly, despite having such a long and illustrious political career. So let me start कि मैं याद करूं कि when I first heard of Ambedkar, or consciously when I encountered Ambedkar, तो ये स्कूल में हुआ और वही सेम किताब जो आप लोग शायद पढ़ रहे हैं, जिसमें अम्बेडकर की मेंशन होता है कि एज द ड्राफ्टिंग चेयरमैन ऑफ द कॉन्स्टिट्यूंट असेंबली। मेरी भी इंट्रोडक्शन अम्बेडकर की इंट्रोडक्शन ऐसे ही थी लगभग। तो एंड ऑफ कोर्स रेट्रोस्पेक्ट में मुझे याद है, क्योंकि मैं साउथ इंडिया से हूँ, दैट a whole bunch of places had Ambedkar's pictures. They had other people also, but a very conscious introduction to Ambedkar only came through these textbooks. And of course, interestingly enough, this introduction to Ambedkar limited his life, his political thought, his contribution to simply the Constitution and the making of the Constitution. And इसे तो of course one doesn't get a picture of why Ambedkar is so important, what did he do that makes him such an important leader and so on. So, and I bring this up because after all these years, I think we are in a place that we are asking the same question again कि Ambedkar आज important क्यों है, या जैसे आपकी जो सर ने बोला कि Ambedkar को याद करना क्यों important है, why is such an institute like Tula's organizing this event on his birth anniversary. What is it about him that is so important that we need to remember him, despite the Constitution and all of these other things. तो मैं कुछ तो before coming to this question of why Ambedkar is important today, मैं थोड़ा पीछे जाऊँ तो 90s में बहुत सारे डिबेट्स हुआ करते थे कि अम्बेडकर कौन है, हाउ टू अंडरस्टैंड अम्बेडकर, एंड शायद यही पहली बार था कि मेन स्ट्रीम लेफ्ट ने अम्बेडकर के बारे में सीरियसली डिस्कस करना या एंगेज करना शुरू किया था. तो एंड देन ऑफ कोर्स दे वर पोज्ड विद दिस इम्पॉर्टेंट क्वेश्चन एज टू who Ambedkar really was and how to understand him. And if I remember correctly, in a previous lecture that I had given to some students from Tula's some years back, I pointed out that there are numerous trajectories in Ambedkar's life, and some, of course, some of them are based on the circumstances of his time, some based on the needs of his time, some given his failing health and so on. But I want to briefly point to some important events in Ambedkar's life that probably will illustrate the diverse sort of political career that he had. Ambedkar took up one of the first Satyagraha protests. The Mahad March took place in 1927. And when Mahad took place, Gandhi and the Dandi March hadn't happened. And so the idea of Satyagraha being so extensively tied down to Gandhi in India didn't happen yet. So, and in that march, at the end of the march, he and his followers burnt the Manusmriti, जो कि उस समय was a very big deal. In 1932, Dr. Ambedkar signed the Pune Pact with Gandhi, and I don't know if you know much about the Pune Pact, but इसमें Gandhi in 1936, Dr. Ambedkar founded the Independent Labour Party, and under its banner, we see one of the biggest mobilizations of the working class in pre-independent India. Almost about 20,000 people were participating in this march. In 1943, with the introduction of the Indian Trade Union Amendment Bill, he made it compulsory for employees to acknowledge trade unions. In 1947, he was elected into the drafting committee, and I'm certain that this part you're familiar with. In 1950, he gives a very famous speech on the contradictions of political and socio-economic life in the life of people in India. मैं ये पढ़ूंगा कि I hope आप थोड़ा ध्यान से सुने इसको. On the 26th of January 1950, we are going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we will have equality, and in social and economic life, we will have inequality. In politics, we will be recognizing the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value. In our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny the principle of one man, one value. How long shall we continue to live this life of contradictions? How long shall we continue to deny equality in our social and economic life? And if we continue to deny it for long, we will do so only by putting our political democracy in peril. We must remove this contradiction at the earliest possible moment, or else those who suffer from inequality will blow up the structure of political democracy, which this assembly has laboriously built up. This was in 1950, and in 1953, just 3 years after the assembly adopted the constitution, Ambedkar, the chairman of the drafting committee, exclaimed in front of a whole bunch of people that he would burn the constitution. It is by placating the sentiments of smaller communities and smaller people who are afraid that the majority may do wrong that the British Parliament works. Sir, my friends tell me that I have made the constitution, but I am quite prepared to say that I shall be the first person to burn it. I do not want it. It does not suit anybody, but whatever that may be, if our people want to carry on, they must not forget that there are majorities and there are minorities, and they simply cannot ignore the minorities by saying, oh no, to recognize you is to harm democracy. And in 1956, along with some 3 lakh people, Ambedkar converted to Buddhism as he saw it the only way forward for his people. So, in all of these debates that were going on in the 90s, and in all of these discussions, people were talking about all of these things and were still figuring out which parts of Ambedkar fit well into their framework and how best to categorize him. And so in some of these debates, they ended up categorizing Ambedkar into 2 halves. One, a revolutionary figure that believed in satyagraha, protests, labor unions, labor parties, so on and so forth. And 2, an Ambedkar that was bound by constitutional ideology and converted to Buddhism. Now, in retrospect, जब मैं वापस देखता हूँ इन debates को, तो it's easy for me to say that ये तरीका बहुत आसान था, ना ही आसान था, बहुत शायद this was also a lazy one. But now, in today's context, a lot has changed. A lot of these left groups have now come to see Ambedkar differently. A whole bunch of people have come to see Ambedkar differently. And now even some of them claim that Ambedkar is a social revolutionary. So there is now a bifurcation of what a revolutionary could be, what it means for life. So instead of a political revolutionary, they now choose to categorize Ambedkar as a social revolutionary. And that their argument is that despite Ambedkar's positions in state and despite his efforts into nation building and so on, into concretizing this idea of India, he did all of this only so that he could get some short results for his people. And so they conceive this as a strategic move. Some people also contest that Ambedkar unlocked the master key, if you will, to our problems of politics today, and he decided to convert to Buddhism. And perhaps there is some truth to both these arguments, or all of these arguments. But if one is to inspect them more closely, then there is a glaring problem that they choose to divorce Ambedkar's ideological sincerity from Ambedkar's political life. That at a certain time, Ambedkar was certain that there are no other ways but the ones that he took up. Point to one thing, that whatever decisions or whatever political stands Ambedkar took at the time, they were all conceived with a strong ideological sincerity that perhaps those who now analyze Ambedkar lack. This is perhaps why I would contest that these are not strategic moves for Ambedkar, but instead they're all principled, ideologically principled stands. So the point I'm trying to make is this: that Ambedkar's life is long and it's marked by complex and various complex shifts in his political ideas and thoughts, and perhaps there is no one way to categorize Ambedkar. But or there is no one framework to see Ambedkar with, because at some points Ambedkar chooses to turn to Marxism, at some points he chooses to turn to Fabian socialism, at some points Buddhism, and so on. But despite all of these contradictions in political thought within his own political life, there seems to me that there is one thing that stands out, and that perhaps that one thing that connects all his political engagements, and this one thing is his lifelong commitment to his people. So, of course, title तो सबकी अम्बेडकर है, but ये सबकी अम्बेडकर कैसे बनते हैं, या क्या इसको हम विदाउट सफिशिएंट क्रिटिकलिटी इसको ले सकते हैं कि नहीं ले सकते हैं, क्या अम्बेडकर सिर्फ दलित नेता हैं, नहीं हैं, ये सारे सवाल मुझे लगता है इसी एक बिंदु के अंदर रिजॉल्व हो सकते हैं. दैट अम्बेडकर की जो कमिटमेंट है और उनकी जो लोगों की प्रति जो कमिटमेंट है, वो कभी भी देयर वाज नो इंस्टेंस वेयर अम्बेडकर gave up on this commitment to his people. And though, of course, there is no easy way to categorize Ambedkar's work or his life. And like I said, oftentimes when we recollect people such as Ambedkar, we sometimes choose to do it with a lot of romanticism. But if we are to deal with the complexity of Ambedkar's political life, then we must keep a sense of objectivity. Otherwise, we would lose sight of what Ambedkar really stood for. The second part, although briefly, I don't know how relevant or important this is for you, but a large part of who Ambedkar is today and how we see Ambedkar comes from what Ambedkarite politics came to represent. And going back to the 90s, I remember that some senior Ambedkarites at the time would tell me that Ambedkar, who was still then locked up in rich people's drawing room, was finally freed. That Ambedkar's writings were being published, they were being translated, and they were being read in a way that was unprecedented. And of course, all this movement in literature was accompanied by politics on ground, and there were a number of groups that sprung up, speaking the language of what they called Ambedkarite politics. If I have to quickly name a few, there was the Dalit Sangharsh Samiti in Karnataka, there was the Dalit Panthers in Maharashtra, the Dalit Panthers Yekam in Tamil Nadu, the BAMSF, and so on and so forth. The DSS, because I was in some sense closely working with them, the DSS was heavily dependent on literature, but with a lot of left inclinations. The Dalit Panther Yekam in Tamil Nadu, which today has morphed into the Vidudalai Chirtegal Party, the VCK, was speaking a mixture of Tamil and Dalit assertions. And the Dalit Panthers in Maharashtra, in Bombay, were organizing slums and chawls against the state, actively taking a radical left approach. And interestingly enough, none of these groups again could be classified easily, and so the politics that they came to represent also represented the complexity of Dr. Ambedkar's political life. And perhaps if one were to look back now and to see them through one framework, then perhaps it would look like that these movements and these groups were pursuing a sense of chaotic politics. But if one is to understand Dr. Ambedkar's political life, then I think these groups represent the same complexity that his life represented. But I won't go into much detail of each group and its history and so on. But today, when BSP, today if we are to think about Ambedkarite politics, perhaps the first thing that would come to your mind is the Bahujan Samaj Party or Mayavati and so on. So today Ambedkarite politics stands at a place where it has mainly come to be represented by elections, by the constitutional method, by the constitution itself, and so on. So from the 90s and up to the 2020s, there has been a drastic shift in what what Ambedkarite politics is and how one perceives this. And perhaps there is a grave danger in trying to settle down to just the constitutional method or just the elections or so on and so forth, or the fact that Mayawati or Kanshiramji or the BSP have come to represent actively what Ambedkarite politics is. Now to the third part, which is which I'm certain that all of you are familiar with, and perhaps you've even read this in your textbooks, that Ambedkar's portrait and the Indian Constitution go hand in hand. They have now come to become very synchronous. And of late, बहुत सारे campaigns भी चल रहे हैं, Save the Constitution, Save Ambedkar, Save We the People of India, and so on. तो Constitution के बारे में आज बहुत सारे इंटरप्रिटेशंस है, बहुत सारे गाने हैं, बहुत सारे आपको प्लेज मिलेंगे, बहुत सारी कहानियाँ मिलेंगी. And so perhaps never before in Indian history the Constitution has had or received so many interpretations. And my contestation is this, that with all of these interpretations, the Indian Constitution has simply come to take a very symbolic form today. तो मैं ये नहीं बोलूँगा कि save the Constitution, because even to say such a thing would speak immensely to the nature of the Constitution. But before I move on, let me give you an idea of what the debates are around this Constitution. But before I do that, Constitution क्या होता है? What is a Constitution? A Constitution is usually the document that functions as, say, a manual for how a state should function and govern. And so, when such a document is open to interpretation, it leaves us open to the wishes of the ruling class that interprets such a document for itself. And in a state where unemployment is so high, where education still remains a dream, even for a lot of Indians to come to such an institution as yours, even today remains a dream. And so in all of these contexts, the idea of interpreting a constitution, I can only read this as being vulgar. बहुत आसान सवाल मेरे लिए बनता है कि can a मजदूर interpret the constitution? And I'm aware that such a question is only rhetorical, but मेरी contestation फिर यही होगी that if you open the constitution for interpretations, and if a document such as this is open to interpretation, then this is exactly what will happen. That a government that is supposed to that a document that is supposed to help you govern and to especially a document that stands by these three important values of equality, fraternity, and justice, when you open this up for interpretation, then such a document, instead of helping you govern and to be able to deliver justice, only succumbs to occupy a symbolic position. So now back to the debates on the constitution itself. गौतम भाटिया एक इम्पॉर्टेंट स्कॉलर हैं, एक ऑथर भी हैं, जिनका एक नया किताब है द ट्रांसफॉर्मेटिव कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन. उसमें वो आर्ग्यू करते हैं कि ब्रॉडली देयर आर टू स्कूल्स ऑफ थॉट व्हेन इट कम्स टू अंडरस्टैंडिंग द इंडियन कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन. और वो बोलते हैं कि एक जो आर्ग्यू करता है दैट द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन इज सिंपली अ कंटिन्यूम, इट्स अ डॉक्यूमेंट दैट वाज अ कैरी ओवर फ्रॉम ब्रिटिश लेजिस्लेशन, एंड देयर इज वन दैट आर्ग्यूज दैट द कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन इज अ ट्रांसफॉर्मेटिव वन, primarily because it came out of a struggle for liberation. I don't want to dwell too much on the arguments, but I simply want to say that there are elements of undeniable truth to both schools of thought, that the constitution definitely borrows from British legislature. In fact, some people say that the number is around 70%, that 70% of the Indian constitution mirrors British legislature. And sorry, not British legislature, the Government of India Act 1935. And of course, today across the world there are perhaps few constitutions like ours that still justify preventive custody. So laws like the UAPA, under which a whole bunch of people are booked and continue to be booked. People like Stan Swamy, who died in prison because he was held in preventive custody. So such laws keep being justified, and the Indian constitution still continues to justify preventive custody. So arguments like this will of course tell you that there is so much truth to the fact that the Indian constitution mirrors a whole bunch of policies and laws that are contained in the 1935 Government India Act. But there is an important distinction. India is no longer a colony. At best, we could describe it as a neo-colonial state. And if and by that I mean that India is a politically independent state, and so there were long drawn struggles fought out to get some fundamental rights. And of course, without the Indian constitution, the depressed classes, as Ambedkar describes them, in India would not have had any legislature that would obligate the Indian state to ensure their participation in politics, in economic life, and so on. And however marginal this number might be, this is an important fact that this constitution enables these people to do this. But to bring more context to this argument, I want to quote Dr. Ambedkar again, where he says, "Democracy in India is only a top dressing on an Indian soil, which is essentially undemocratic." Although I'm not sure what essentially undemocratic means when he says this, but I think that the underpinnings of this quote have a whole bunch of truth about the Indian condition, and perhaps this would help us understand the Indian constitution better. The Indian in the Constituent Assembly, when this constitution was being drafted, this assembly had only 3 members who were Dalits, including Dr. Ambedkar himself. The assembly was overwhelmingly dominated by Hindu men, roughly about 94%. There were very few women, and of course there are other you can categorize them by province and by the place of origin and so on, which would still point to a large number of them being from North India. If this is the case, and if this is the context with which the Indian Constitution comes to be adopted, then how can such a document become transformative? And if such a document should be allowed to be transformed, then on what basis should those whose only rights are enshrined in this one document allow this transformation? So now I want to return to that quote that I read in the beginning, and to emphasize on the nature of India's contradictions. Again, here Ambedkar says, in politics we have equality, and in social and economic life we have inequality. He says that in politics we recognize the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value. But in our social and economic life, we shall, by reason of our social and economic structure, continue to deny this principle. And more importantly, he says that if we continue to deny it for long, we will do so by putting a political democracy in peril. And so we must, at the earliest possible moment, remove this contradiction. So, but when I say this, the important question in my mind is that why didn't Ambedkar think that the earliest possible moment was when he was drafting this constitution, or perhaps before this constitution was even adopted? So why did Ambedkar take on such an endeavor when he understood the urgency of resolving this duality within India? Why did he not heed his own warning? And so perhaps this is why merely 3 years after the adoption of the constitution, Ambedkar declared that he would burn it. And what Ambedkar only said, Periyar did. In a whole bunch of places in Tamil Nadu, Periyar and his followers burnt copies of the constitution. And I bring up Periyar for a very specific reason, that a transformative constitution as such in India, perhaps also everywhere else in the world, still has limits. That these transformations cannot transcend a certain limit, and whether this limit is nationality, whether this limit is state, whether this limit is religion, is decided by those occupying positions of politics today. So, and in this, if such a constitution can be transformed, then it's a very important and dangerous historic moment, because then such a constitution can have parallel histories, and that that such a constitution will be remembered for its positive transformative potential by those who saw it transformed for the better for them, and will be remembered for its negative transformative potential by those who lack to see this constitution be transformed for their interests. And so such a constitution not only harbors old contradictions without ever trying to resolve these contradictions, but such a constitution also creates newer contradictions. So, like I was mentioning earlier, and like also what Aditya had spoke on, that Ambedkar's life is long, Ambedkar's life is diverse, Ambedkar's life is marked by a whole bunch of political shifts and moves. But yet Ambedkar still lives on with this constitution. That Ambedkar, and that this Ambedkar who lives on with this constitution, even if it is momentary, resolves these contradictions of between those of the oppressed sections of India with those of the oppressive sections of India, without ever really seeing them take any shape in the physical. And this Ambedkar that lives on with the contradiction with this constitution, even one could say that he sort of resolves the contradiction between the landless of this people and the landless people of this country and the landed people of this country. And so this Ambedkar that has now come to be seen as synchronous with the constitution has become a symbol for those hiding behind this constitution. So, and again, like I pointed out, Ambedkar who had such a diverse political life, who continues to empower so many people to raise their voice against the lack of rights or so on and so forth, has sort of been subsumed by this shadow of the Indian Constitution. And like I pointed out earlier, that Ambedkar should not be limited to any one category, and only in that will we be able to recognize Ambedkar's true political potential. And before I end, I want to quote Lenin on what he thought of constitutions and of what he thought of legality. Lenin says, "If political power in the state is in the hands of a class whose interests coincide with those of the majority, that state can be governed truly in line with the will of the majority. But if political power is in the hands of a class whose interests diverge from those of the majority, any form of majority rule is bound to become deceptive or become suppressive for the majority. Every bourgeois republic provides hundreds and thousands of examples of this kind." And this is why no oppressed sections of the world can afford to have a transformative constitution, because eventually they will exclude the oppressed sections from this process of transforming the constitution, and such an exclusion cannot to such an exclusion such constitutions such transformative constitutions will only look on as silent spectators to this change in social and cultural life. And so I want to end by lastly saying that Ambedkar says that lost rights are never regained by appeal to the conscience of the usurpers, but by relentless struggle. So what we have in front of us is a long road of struggle, and like the song that they sang here, we must fight despite what today looks like. And so thank you for giving me this opportunity, Aditya, and thank you for patiently sitting here and listening. Jai Hind.